Looks like it's time for another safety week. Now we all know the old standbys. Don't go running around with scissors in your hands, always wear your safety glasses, and don't drink beer in the shop. But there are so many other things that you can do in your shop as far as organization or small jigs to help keep yourself safer in the way that you do your work. So what I'd like to do are a couple of things that I've done here in my shop in case you can use it in yours. Now many times you need to cross cut at the table saw, so you need to take a small piece here and you're just going to want to take off a little bit off here. And it's always so tempting to just slide this little fence over and set it to, let's just set this thing to 7 inches and go and do the cut. Of course you're going to have a piece between the blade and the fence, and we all know that that's a risk at binding and then ultimately kickback. So you're never going to want to do that, but it's always so tempting. So what I've done is I created a simple block here. This is just 2 pieces of 1/2 inch MDF that I glued together. I mean, if you can find a piece of 1 inch MDF, go for it. This just makes it really convenient for me to basically burn an inch on the fence. So what I do if I want to set it to 7 inches for a crosscut is I would actually set this up to 8 inches here. I put this block here, which is always conveniently on this fence. It fits inside the fence. So I just put it here, and now when I go to push for doing a crosscut, if I get the guard out of the way, you can see that the block has stayed back here. This is clear, and because it's basically exactly an inch, I've never had any problem where I can just set the fence here, make my cut, and it's right on the money. So there's probably an expression out there that says sharp tools are safe tools. Now, if you have a chisel that's dull, it's going to be a lot more dangerous than a sharp chisel. We've all known that. But what my point is that you need to have a way of sharpening quickly exactly where you're at. Now, in this case here, I built this simple pond for some stones. Now, in this case here, these are shaptons, so they don't really need to be soaked in water at all, even though this design actually comes more from regular water stone. But if I spritz this with a little bit of water, I can easily remove any wire edge that's developed as I've been doing some work on some wood, or if for some reason it's a chisel that I did a lot of work on recently and I haven't gotten to honing, well, as soon as I realize it's a bit dull, it's right here. I can sharpen it up and get back to work. Now, in the case of paring, of course, there's so many different ways of doing paring, and everybody's a little different in the way they do it. You know, maybe you're the type that's gutsy and likes to do it this way here. But normally you're going to want to hang on to the back handle for doing your paring, but then you're going to want to hang on to it near the front with your fingers, both to guide it and also to limit how far it can go if it ever goes to break free. Now, in this case here, you might think, well, it's not bad if it breaks free, you're just going to stab your water pond. But there's always a chance that you're going to hurt yourself or damage something in your product. Now, if you're just putting down some varnish, of course, there's a lot of mineral spirits that flash off, and maybe you're okay with that. It's still not the best thing for you, but it's probably not going to kill you. But there are some things you do need to be a bit more careful with. Now, for one, I really like using this clean strip brush cleaner. Whenever I've done remodeling work on my house and some other houses, there's always going to be a brush that gets left off on the side and becomes absolutely rock hard. This stuff will soften up any brush, and in order to do that, it can basically dissolve anything, including your brain. If you've ever smelled this stuff, or even when you're outside and there's a breeze, this stuff can give you a headache in minutes. So always make sure that you have a mask on for this. Now, other products are a little bit sneakier. Like this is a plastic resin glue. Now, plastic resin glue is basically a 2-part where the second part is water. In this case here, what this liberates is formaldehyde. Now, that's not good for you either, but you really don't smell much of it because it's coming off kind of slowly. Overall, there's a big volume of it, but you don't smell it as it's going. So that can almost be a little bit more dangerous because it kind of sneaks up on you and smacks you upside the head. Now, a long time ago, Marc Spagnuolo turned me on to using products like clear penetrating epoxy for certain outdoor applications, and I've actually had to do quite a few projects with it since then. Now, this is another epoxy, so it's a 2-part product that goes through a chemical reaction, and in the process it liberates a lot of fumes. Now, this stuff here is pretty nasty with the fumes as well. This would be on par with, say, the brush cleaner. So, but this one here, at least you're going to smell it, so you're going to remember. But I would highly, highly recommend wearing a mask when you're using a product like this as well. I've used this when I was doing work outside, and even though there was a pretty good breeze, if you don't have the mask on, you're going to know it. Now, one other aspect about the fumes that can come off of these different chemical reactions is, if you look around, I'm inside of a garage shop. This garage shop is inside of a 2-story house. So immediately above my garage is part of my living house. Now, of course, it's nice to think that the people that framed this house really did an excellent job sealing it, but I can assure you they did a horrible job of doing that whenever I get my electric bill. Now, when I'm doing something with something like plastic resin, as I mentioned, you don't really smell it much. But of course, the fumes that are piling up inside my garage shop are going to find little nooks and crannies to be able to sneak into my house. Now, it may not be very much, it may not be enough to cause any problems, but of course it's getting in there. and you're not really going to smell it in the case of the formaldehyde. But when I'm talking about products like this, these are going to really announce themselves. So you'll be in there wondering, how did it get in here? So just be conscious of the idea that, now if you're on a one-story house and you have an attached garage, maybe it'll just go up in the attic and it'll get vented out the gable. But in this case here, it's going up into my spare bedroom. Now maybe it's just me lately, but I've been building a lot of larger cabinet projects. So sometimes I'll be ripping 6 to 10 foot boards on the table saw because I actually need them for the project that size. Now I do have an outfeed table that I just hook off onto the back, and almost everybody has an outfeed table. So that's not something to be concerned about, but many times you need an infeed table to give yourself some added support so that you can spend more time controlling the wood going through the table saw than worrying about balancing it and controlling it at the same time. So to that end, I took a simple scrap applied a cleat to the front of it with some MDF that was the right thickness to compensate for the gap here. And what it does is it sits in this gap between the fence and the tabletop. So it's very quick for me to put it in. I just drop it like that and basically I'm done. Now I just take a roller stand and put it on the other end. Now I have support for the longer boards as they go through. Now of course I would scoot this over. Now again, leaning to the idea of having to set things up quickly, you want this roller stand to be quickly adapted. And that's where the magic of a Sharpie comes in. All you do is you set this up once, get it level, and then mark on the stand itself, infeed, and put a line there. Now I can just retract this till I get to that line, lock it, and set up the infeed table in seconds. Now for the bandsaw, I made just a piece of plywood, a small block, and a pair of rare earth magnets. What this is for me to place it right here. And what it does is it covers up the on-off switch. Now, this isn't to keep me from using the bandsaw, although honestly there's probably some days I should do that. Why I have this here is to remind me that I need to tension the blade. Now the manufacturer of my saw blade, which is a Resaw King from Laguna, they recommend detensioning the blade between uses simply because it's a very, very long life blade. It's intended to go for 20 to 40 sharpenings. Now, I have my saw blade detensioned, but if I came over here not paying attention and I start up the blade detensioned, of course, it's going to damage the blade, it's probably going to get it caught up into the wheel, and it could cause any number of other damage. So what's nice is with this, it reminds me that I can simply pop it up here where the tensioning switch is. So once I've tensioned it, I just leave it up there. Now, I automatically know, because I have access to the switch, that this has been tensioned. When I go and I detension the blade, because this board actually covers up the tensioning lever, then I move it back over here just to remind me. Now, one of the disadvantages of a power tool shop is that you're going to have a lot of power cords going around, and typically you're going to also have some vacuum hoses. Now, these things tend to be dragged on the ground, which is, of course, trying to share space with your feet. Now, what I use is a boom arm on my vacuum. Not everybody's going to go for that route, but the idea is something that you can easily adapt. Now, the idea of the boom arm is simply to take the vacuum hoses and the power cords and get them off the ground. So this is not going to be dragging your hose over top of your work. It's not going to get tangled in anything that's on your bench, and you're not going to get your feet tangled up in it either. Now, of course, this is a boom arm that happens to work with the Festool vacuum, but there are plenty of other options that you can make, including a lot of DIY ideas. Now, a friend of mine, Diami, has an article on his blog posting that describes a boom arm that he made off of his wall, and he actually has a couple of them in different places, so that for the most part, he's always close to a boom arm. Now, it's just a fantastic idea for getting these things off the ground. Now, another idea is to use these reels and mount it up on the ceiling. So this is a Rockler reel. It has a 50-foot cable. It's going to be 12 gauge, so it's going to work with any of your power tools. But it's nice that I can drag this across the shop, and it's always going to be at least taut, so it's not going to be on the ground. If I need it on the ground, I can just pull more slack. So this is a fantastic idea to incorporate in your shop. Now at the bandsaw, I like to use a special push stick that I made, which is just a scrap piece of oak, and I put a little domino hole in it and popped a little domino in it. Now when I'm cutting a board, it's very easy for me to hang on to it here and use the domino as a hook for pushing the material through. The best part about it is if I hit the blade with the domino, I just pop the domino out and put a new one in. Now of course you don't need to do this with dominoes if you don't have a domino. You could easily do some idea like this with maybe a 3/4 inch dowel. You could drill a 3/4 inch hole, chop off a bunch of little slugs of a 3/4 inch dowel, so you just plug one in, go ahead and use it for the longest time, and then once it becomes a little bit too beat up, pull it out and replace it. Now in mentioning the different chemicals that we need to be cautious of in the shop, we're talking about mineral spirits, naphtha, anything like that that's going to flash off into the air and become basically an air hazard. In this case here, mineral spirits is often used when you're doing some cleanup. Now it turns out I bought this one by accident once. It's called green mineral spirits. It's supposed to be a little bit more environmentally safe and friendly and all that. Basically what it is it's an emulsion of mineral spirits in water, and the bulk of it is water. So you don't get as much of the mineral spirits. Now, I personally don't use this in any varnish. Maybe it works great in there, but I just don't want to take a chance on it because it looks milky white. But for cleaning, this is fantastic. One reason is that the emulsion is very sticky. So if I spray it onto something, it'll even coat the sides of a jar that I'm trying to soften up something that I need to clean out of there. So if I'm cleaning some small dishes that I use for varnish, of course, if I just give it a quick spritz, I can leave it there for an hour, and when I come back, most of it is still stuck onto the sides, and it's cleaned up very, very well. The other advantage is the emulsion prevents it from actually flashing off. It's holding the mineral spirits there. So the mineral spirits is dissolving off the varnish that's not cured yet, but at the same time, it's not being flashed off and getting into the air. When you're using the regular mineral spirits, of course, you're pouring some in, and then some of it flashes off, so you need to pour a little bit more. So get yourself a bucket of this. It's a little bit cheaper actually than regular mineral spirits because there isn't a lot of it in this, but it's excellent for doing cleanup. Now, in some of my previous videos, you might have noticed that on my quick grip clamps, I've got a tennis ball mounted on the back of it. Now, why would I bother doing that? I happen to have a set of tennis balls that I cut a small hole in, and the idea is that sometimes when I'm doing a glue up, I end up having to use some of the longer clamps, like these big 36s, because I've run out of 18s or 24s. Now, granted, it works, but your project starts to look like a porcupine sitting on the assembly bench, and it's really easy to accidentally forget to see one of these edges, and you can walk right into it. So it's nice that if I have a couple of these, and there's one sticking out in a particularly precarious place, you just squeeze this, pop it over the edge. Now, when you're at the bandsaw, you always have to be conscious of the blade. Keep a good eye on the blade. But sometimes when you're doing some work, you're going to be pushing a board through here, and you're needing to pull it out simultaneously, typically when you're near the end of a cut. Now, it's tempting to stand here where the blade is located perpendicular to you. Now, that's fine if everything is going to go great, but once in a while, the blade might decide to snap. And when it snaps, you don't really know what it's going to do, yet you're in the way. Now, recently, my bandsaw, one of the thrust bearings locked up, and it jammed the blade, and then the blade snapped while I was doing a cut. Now, I was standing over there, so I was fine. But I try to avoid standing here because, like in that case, it was a good example. What happened is the blade continued to go down through the table, of course, where it snapped was below the table. So this part here continued to carry down. It hit the top of the cabinet, and then, of course, it stopped. But then the blade started to loop out. So a large loop of the blade came out to the side of the table, and then once it got so far that the loop couldn't hang on to the top of the table, it snapped. So then it did like a bullwhip crack straight down. Now, had I been standing here when that was happening, I'd be singing soprano right now. So you want to try avoiding standing on the side of the table if at all possible. Now, when I do need to do this type of an operation, I tend to try doing it from here or doing it from here. But always leave the blade room to go. Now, everybody knows to have a fire extinguisher in the shop, but you have to give a little bit of thought to the placement. In my case, I have mine by the door that enters into the shop. Why? Because if I'm in the house and I suddenly smell some smoke, I know it's, maybe I left some oily rags or something like that, I'm going to need to get in here and get the fire extinguisher right away. If I'm outside the shop, well, there I happen to have a hose, so that won't be quite as difficult. But the reason I bring this up is I had a friend come over and said, well, why do you have a fire extinguisher here by the door? Thinking that the chemicals that I'm worried about are over in the far corner over there and the far corner over there. But of course, you don't want the fire extinguisher near where the fire source is. So I know that that makes perfect sense when it's explained, and it's probably one of those, of course. But in this case here, be conscious of where you put the fire extinguisher. Make sure it's going to be exactly where you want it when you smell a fire. Now, one other safety concern in a power tool shop is having enough power. Doesn't mean you have to necessarily run a sub panel to your shop, but make sure that you have enough power or that everything is distributed properly so that you're not going to be in the middle of doing something and lose power on it. Nobody wants a spinning tool to suddenly slow down, burning wood, things like that because you popped a breaker, or worse, pop a breaker that also happens to be the one with your lights. Of course, every shop needs to have a well-equipped first aid kit. Make sure that it's loaded with everything that you're going to need. Now, of course, a lot of times you'll have just a small box where you threw a couple, odds and ends of Band-Aids in there, and you're hoping to call that a first aid kit, but you really should take it seriously, because the day that you're really going to need it, you're not going to be able to go scrounging around inside the house. Plus, you probably want to hide the fact that you poked your finger with something. Now, all this talk of air respirators is all for naught if you don't take air quality seriously in your shop, which is exactly why I have rules posted in mine.